The fall of Covenant Station. Covenant Station was not a warship. It was never built to fight anything. It was built to hold people. 340,000 of them, to be exact. Families who had followed the mining contracts out past the inner systems. Engineers who had spent their careers keeping the gas processors running on Cathara IV. Children who had grown up knowing nothing but the soft hum of recycled air and the slow spin of the station's rotating rings. Old men and women who had come out here to retire quietly, far from the noise of the inner worlds. There were schools on Covenant Station. There were market streets. There was a small park on Ring 7 with artificial grass and a ceiling painted to look like a blue sky where parents brought their children on weekends. It was a home. For 340,000 people, it was the only home they had ever known. The Velhari Dominion destroyed it on a Tuesday. There was no warning, no ultimatum, no evacuation order broadcast on any frequency. The Velhari High Command had decided, in a meeting that probably lasted no more than 2 hours, that the space around Cathara IV fell within a territorial corridor they intended to claim. Covenant Station sat inside that corridor. The Velhari military planners had looked at the maps, looked at the station, and made a calculation. The station was not a military target. But it was an obstacle, and removing obstacles was something the Dominion did efficiently and without sentiment. 11 Velhari warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Cathara system at 3:40 station time, when most of Covenant Station was asleep. The first volley of kinetic slugs hit the station's docking rings before a single alarm had finished sounding. The evacuation pods, rows and rows of them, enough to carry every single person on the station to safety, were destroyed in the first 4 minutes. Not by accident, by design. The Velhari gunners had been briefed to eliminate escape capacity first. It was efficient work. By the time the station's emergency broadcast reached the nearest human military relay, Covenant Station had been burning for 11 minutes. Admiral Seraphine Vale was in her command chair aboard the heavy cruiser HCSV Remembrance when the signal arrived. She had been reviewing patrol schedules, a routine task, the kind of administrative work that filled most of a fleet commander's day. Her coffee had gone cold. She was about to call for a fresh cup when her communications officer, a young lieutenant named Eris, turned from his console with a look on his face that Vale had learned to read over 15 years of service. It was the look that meant something had gone wrong in a way that could not be undone. "Admiral," Eris said. His voice was very steady, the way voices get when a person is working hard to keep them that way. "We have an emergency signal from Covenant Station. It is a mass casualty event, ma'am. The signal is 11 minutes old." Vale set down her cold coffee, put it through. What came through was not a clean distress call. It was fragments, pieces of automated emergency broadcasts layered over human voices, some of them screaming, some of them giving instructions in the flat, fast tone of people who knew they were going to die and were trying to do something useful with their last minutes. There was a woman's voice near the end of the recording, very calm, reading a list of shelter coordinates to anyone who could hear her. The recording cut off before she finished the list. Vale listened to all of it. She did not move. "Navigation," she said when the recording ended. "Best FTL solution to the Cathara system, now." "Already plotted, Admiral. 15 minutes to jump, 6 hours transit." 6 hours, 11 minutes already gone. She did not need to do the math out loud. "Jump as soon as we are ready," she said. "Signal the rest of the fleet. All ships, all speed, Cathara system." The Remembrance went to FTL 17 minutes later. Vale sat in her command chair for the entire 6-hour transit and did not sleep. She did not pace. She did not speak unless spoken to. She sat with her hands folded on the console in front of her and looked at the star field on the main screen, which was not really a star field but a visual representation of the FTL tunnel the ship was moving through. Her face was still. If anyone on the bridge had looked closely, they might have noticed that her knuckles, where her hands were folded together, had gone very white. Nobody looked closely. The bridge was quiet. Everyone had heard the recording. They came out of FTL at the edge of the Cathara system, 6 hours and 4 minutes after the signal had been sent. Covenant Station was still visible on the long-range sensors. What remained of it anyway? The main ring structure had broken in 3 places. 2 of the residential rings had lost all pressure. The station's core was venting gas in long, slow spirals that caught the distant light of Cathara's sun and turned them into something almost beautiful if you did not know what they were. Vale looked at the sensor display for a long time. "Survivors?" she asked. Her tactical officer, Commander Adara Tesh, answered without looking up from her console. Her voice was the same careful flat tone that Eris had used earlier. It seemed to be spreading through the bridge like a quiet infection. "Negative, Admiral. We are reading no life signs. No emergency beacons active. No debris consistent with pod ejection. The docking rings appear to have been targeted first." She paused. "The evacuation pods were destroyed before anyone could launch them." Vale closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then she opened them. "Scan for Velhari drive signatures." 11 signatures, Admiral. FTL departure vectors consistent with Dominion space. They left approximately 5 hours ago. They had done their work and gone home. Vale pressed a single key on her console. The casualty estimate feed opened on her personal screen, a running total built from the station's last census data. 342,117 people. The number sat on the screen in plain white text. No color coding, no graphics, just numbers. She read every figure. She did not rush. Then she closed the feed, unfolded her hands, and pressed the ship-wide intercom. "This is Admiral Vale," she said. Her voice was calm. It was the most frightening thing anyone on the ship had heard all day, not because it was angry, but because it was not. "All crew, all departments, take a moment. Remember what you are looking at on your screens right now. Remember the name Covenant Station. Remember what happened here today, and remember that it happened to civilians, to families, to people who were not soldiers and were not given a chance to run." She paused. "We will not forget them. Every one of them will be counted. Every one of them will be remembered. That is a promise from this ship and from this fleet and from me personally." She clicked off the intercom. She turned to Tesh. "I want a full forensic scan of the debris field. Drive signature analysis, weapons pattern analysis, full documentation. I want a report that can stand up in front of any tribunal in the galaxy." "Understood." "I also want a recovery team assembled. Whatever we can find out there, personal effects, station logs, anything, we bring it home." Tesh hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "Admiral, there will not be much to recover." "Then we recover what there is," Vale said simply. The Velhari Dominion sent their diplomatic communique 48 hours later. It was polite, as these things go. It acknowledged that there had been a military action in the Cathara corridor and expressed that the Dominion was prepared to discuss terms of territorial acknowledgement at the earliest convenience of the human government. The word civilians did not appear in the communique. The number 340,000 did not appear in the communique. The Galactic Conclave, the multi-species governing body that spent most of its time trying to stop wars before they started, immediately sent its own message to the human fleet. The Korathi elder who led the Conclave's peacekeeping division urged Admiral Vale, in warm and careful language, to pursue a diplomatic path. He spoke of the dangers of escalation. He spoke of the long history of conflicts that had grown beyond anyone's intention. He was a good man, and he meant everything he said. Vale read both messages. She set them aside in the same folder. Then she called her senior officers to the briefing room. She stood at the head of the table and looked at the faces around her, people she had served with for years, people who had also heard the recording, who had also seen the sensor images, who had also helped the recovery teams bring back what little there was to bring back from the debris field. "The Dominion believes this is over," she said. "They believe we will negotiate. They believe we will take their apology and their small reparation offer and find a way to move forward." She let that sit for a moment. "They do not understand us very well." Nobody at the table argued with her. "We are not going to rush," she continued. "We are not going to strike out of grief and make mistakes. We are going to be patient. We are going to be precise. And when we move, we are going to make absolutely certain that what happened at Covenant Station never, ever happens to anyone again." She looked around the table one more time. "Start making plans. We have work to do." She did not raise her voice once during the entire briefing. That was the most frightening part. Outside the remembrance, in the cold dark of the Cathara system, the broken pieces of Covenant Station continued their slow drift. 342,117 names floated with them, unspoken but not forgotten, waiting for the moment when someone would finally answer for them. That moment was coming. It would just take a little time. The patience of predators. 6 months passed. The galaxy watched, and the galaxy waited, and the galaxy grew increasingly confused. Every species in the Galactic Conclave had a theory about what the humans were going to do. The Korathi, who were old and had seen many wars, believed the humans were grieving and would eventually come to the negotiating table. The Skari, a proud warrior species from the Outer Rim, believed the humans were afraid and were using diplomacy as a way to avoid a fight they knew they could not win. The Velhari Dominion, whose military advisors were the most confident of all, believed they had already won, that the destruction of Covenant Station had demonstrated so clearly the cost of opposing the Dominion that the humans had simply decided it was not worth the price. None of them were right. What the humans were doing in those 6 quiet months was working. The shipyards on Titan ran 24 hours a day. The ones on Callisto ran 24 hours a day. New construction facilities that had been mothballed for decades were opened up, cleaned out, and staffed within 3 weeks of the Covenant Station attack. Humans who had spent their careers in civilian manufacturing were reassigned to military contracts. Resource extraction across the outer belt systems was doubled, then tripled. The human industrial machine, which had been sitting at a comfortable peacetime pace for nearly 40 years, was pushed to a speed that surprised even the people running it. But it was not just the building that mattered, it was the planning. Admiral Vale did not spend those 6 months angry. Anger was a fire that burned fast and burned careless, and she could not afford careless. She spent those months sitting with her senior intelligence analysts, going over Velhari star maps one system at a time. She spent them reading reports from every deep-cover intelligence asset in Dominion space. She spent them running tactical simulations, tearing apart the results, running them again. She built up a picture of the Velhari military, not just where their fleets were, but where their supplies came from, how long those supplies took to move, which relay stations carried the most critical communications, which repair depots a fleet could not function without. She was not planning a war the way a sword fight is planned, fast, close, personal. She was planning it the way a flood is planned, patient, inevitable, coming from every direction at once. There was a moment, 4 months in, when the Conclave sent another diplomatic envoy. This one was younger than the Korathi Elder, a Skari representative named Velorath, known for his skill at getting opposing sides into the same room. He arrived aboard the Remembrance with a small staff and a large folder of proposed treaty frameworks and the confidence of a man who believed that every conflict, given enough skilled negotiation, could be resolved. Vale received him in the ship's small conference room. She offered him tea. She sat across from him and listened while he explained, at considerable length, why a negotiated settlement was in humanity's best interests. He talked about the Dominion's military strength. He talked about the cost of prolonged conflict. He talked about the importance of maintaining stability in the corridor regions. Vale listened to all of it, She was very polite. She asked a few clarifying questions that Veloreth found oddly specific, things about supply chain logistics and FTL relay station redundancy that seemed out of place in a diplomatic conversation. At the end, he presented his proposed framework: territory concessions, modest reparations, a formal Dominion acknowledgement of regrettable loss of life. Vale looked at the document for a moment, then she slid it back across the table. "I appreciate you coming," she said, "truly, but I think there has been a misunderstanding about where we are in this process." Veloreth frowned. "And where are we, Admiral?" "We are not at the part where we negotiate," she said pleasantly. "We are still at the part where we prepare." She stood, which was a polite signal that the meeting was over. "When we are ready to begin, the Dominion will know." Veloreth left the remembrance unsettled in a way he could not quite name. He filed a report with the conclave that included the phrase, "Admiral Vale appears to be in full control of her faculties, but seems remarkably unconcerned with diplomatic timelines." The conclave filed the report and sent 3 more follow-up messages to the human government. None of them received substantive replies. The Velhari Dominion, meanwhile, was making its own preparations, but of a very different kind. They were consolidating. Having claimed the Cathara corridor, the Dominion moved quickly to establish permanent military infrastructure there. New stations, new supply depots, new patrol routes. The High Command were pleased with themselves. The operation had gone exactly as planned, better than planned. The humans had made noise but had not moved, which, in the Dominion's experience, meant they would not move at all. Supreme Commander Vrethax, the aged general who had approved the Cathara operation, gave a speech at a Dominion military gathering 3 months after the attack. He spoke of the corridor as a secured asset. He spoke of human hesitation as evidence of a species that had grown soft after decades of peace. He called the Covenant Station operation a clean demonstration of intent, and received applause from the assembled officers. There was one person in that room who did not applaud. Esethara, a young diplomatic officer from the Dominion's third house, sat at the back of the gathering and kept her hands in her lap. She was not soft. No one rose through the ranks of Velhari diplomacy by being soft. But she had been assigned to monitor the human response channels for the past 3 months, and what she had been watching did not look like a soft species adjusting to defeat. It looked like a species that had stopped talking and started counting. Counting ships, counting resources, counting time. She had written 3 internal memos suggesting that the Dominion reconsider its assessment of the human response. All 3 had been noted, acknowledged, and filed away by men who were certain they already understood the situation. Esethara was given a new assignment. She was to travel to the HCSV Remembrance and deliver the Dominion's formal territorial claim documentation to Admiral Vale in person. It was considered a routine diplomatic formality, a way of making the claim legally registered, a paperwork exercise. She accepted the assignment without comment. She arrived aboard the Remembrance on a gray morning by ship's clock. She had been on human vessels before, briefly, and had always found them strange, not intimidating, just different. Too much open space in the corridors. Odd little touches that served no obvious military purpose. Photographs pinned near crew quarters, small plants in hydroponics bays, hand-drawn pictures on the wall outside what turned out to be the ship's medical bay. She was led to the command deck, where Admiral Vale was standing at a holographic star mapped the size of a large table. 2 of her senior officers stood with her, and all 3 were in the middle of what appeared to be a detailed technical conversation. When Esethara entered, the officers stepped back. The holographic map stayed up. Esethara looked at it. It was a map of Velhari space. Not a rough overview, a detailed, annotated, precisely rendered map of Velhari military installations, supply lines, and fleet positions. There were markings she recognized as tactical notations, The map was covered in them. Vale turned to face her guest. She was a tall woman, lean, with close-cropped gray hair and eyes the color of deep water. She did not smile, but she was perfectly courteous. "Diplomat Esethara," she said, "welcome aboard the Remembrance." Esethara delivered the territorial documentation. She read the formal statement as she had been trained to do, in full, without rushing. She presented the documents. She explained the Dominion's position. Then she waited for the response she had been told to expect, some form of acknowledgement, a counter-proposal, the beginning of a negotiation that the High Command was certain would go in their favor. Vale took the documents. She looked at them briefly. Then she set them on the edge of the star map table, not carelessly, but with the air of someone placing an object in a spot where it would not be in the way. "Tell your High Command," she said, "that we have also been preparing terms. They will receive them shortly." She looked back at the map. "In person." Esethara looked at the map again, at the annotations, at the sheer scope of what was laid out across that table. "Admiral," she said carefully, "may I ask, how long have you been planning this?" Vale looked at her. Something moved briefly behind those deep-water eyes. "Since 11 minutes after we received the signal from Covenant Station," she said. "That was when I knew the Dominion had destroyed the evacuation pods first." She looked back at the map. "That was when I understood exactly what kind of response was necessary." Esethara left the Remembrance 20 minutes later. She did not file a routine report. She sent an urgent coded message to 3 different senior officials in the Dominion's government, marked highest priority. None of them took action on it in time. 6 weeks later, Admiral Seraphine Vale gave the order to begin. The reckoning begins. The Velhari Dominion's morning shift commanders were in the middle of their routine briefings when the alerts started coming in. The first alert was from Outpost Kesh-9, a military refueling station on the far edge of the frontier. It reported contact with an unidentified human fleet formation and then went silent. That was strange. Concerning, even. But Kesh-9 was small and isolated, and the duty officer on watch logged it and sent a query to the nearest patrol group. The nearest patrol group did not answer. Because while the duty officer was waiting for that answer, the second alert came in. Then the third. Then 4 more simultaneously. By the time the Dominion's Central Command had fully staffed its overnight crisis center and was trying to build a coherent picture of what was happening, 17 different military installations across the Velhari frontier had either gone dark or reported active contact with human forces. 17, at the same moment, across a stretch of space that would have taken a single fleet weeks to cross. It was not a counterattack. It was not a raid. It was a declaration delivered in the language the Velhari High Command had spent their entire careers learning to speak, the language of military force, and the message was very clear. "We have been watching you for 6 months. We know where everything is, and we are everywhere at once." Admiral Vale watched the reports come in from the command center of the Remembrance, which had positioned itself at the center of the campaign's operational web like the center of a very large, very patient spider. Around her, her staff worked calmly and steadily. There was no cheering. There was no excitement in the room. People called out updates, confirmed coordinates, relayed orders in the flat professional voices of people who had prepared for this so thoroughly that the execution felt almost routine. That was exactly how Vale had trained them. The 17 simultaneous strikes were only the opening. Each target had been chosen not for drama, but for function, supply depots that fed the frontier fleets, FTL relay stations that carried Dominion military communications, repair facilities that allowed warships to stay operational for extended deployments. None of them were civilian targets. Every one of them was a load-bearing pillar of the Velhari military machine. And in another twist that the Dominion's commanders would puzzle over for years afterward, many of the relay stations were not destroyed. They were seized. Human electronic warfare teams moved into the captured stations before the dust had settled and turned the Dominion's own communication infrastructure against them, sending false status reports, intercepting real ones, filling the Velhari command network with noise and delay at the exact moment it was most needed. The Dominion's frontier forces did not know if they had lost 10 ships or 100. They did not know if help was coming or if the relief fleets had also been hit. They fired at sensor ghosts and waited for orders that arrived scrambled and hours late. It was not the fire and fury of a revenge strike. It was something colder and more thorough than that. It was the dismantling of a machine, piece by piece, by engineers who had spent 6 months learning exactly how the machine worked. The Galactic Conclave convened an emergency session on the 3rd day of the campaign. The chamber was full. Species who rarely bothered attending conclave sessions in person had sent representatives, because what was happening in the Velhari frontier was the kind of thing that made every civilization in the galaxy suddenly very interested in where things were going. The Korathi elder who led the peacekeeping division gave a long speech about the dangers of unchecked military action. Several other representatives made shorter speeches in the same vein. There was agreement around the chamber that someone needed to speak to the humans. There was less agreement about who wanted to be that someone. In the end, Elder Velmassian of the Korathi took on the task himself. He was respected, experienced, and genuinely well-intentioned, and he had worked with human diplomats before and found them reasonable people. He requested and received permission to board the HCSV Remembrance under a diplomatic flag. He arrived to find the ship busy in the way that a well-run operation is busy, purposeful, organized, low on wasted motion. He was treated with complete courtesy. He was given a good meal. He was shown to the main briefing room where Admiral Vale met him within 10 minutes of his arrival. She looked, he thought, exactly the same as she always looked in the news feeds, lean and gray and unhurried. She sat across from him, folded her hands on the table and waited for him to speak. Velmassian spoke well. He had been preparing his words carefully during the transit to the Remembrance, and he delivered them with the warmth and careful logic of a man who had spent 60 years helping civilizations find paths away from the edges of cliffs. He spoke about the Dominion's civilian population, the millions of ordinary Velhari citizens who had nothing to do with the military decisions of their government. He spoke about proportionality. He spoke about the difference between justice and destruction. He said that humanity had made its point, loudly and clearly, and that the galaxy had heard it. Then he used the word. "Admiral Vale," he said, leaning forward slightly, his voice gentle. "Surely now, after these victories, you can afford to show compassion. The Dominion's people did not order the strike on Covenant Station. What has been achieved in 3 days of fighting is already extraordinary. Proportional justice has been served. Show them mercy. Stop the advance. Come to the table." The briefing room was quiet. Vale looked at the elder across the table. She did not look angry. She did not look cold. She looked, very briefly, like a person who was carrying something very heavy and was used to the weight of it. Then she smiled. It was a small smile. It did not reach her eyes. "Show compassion," she said. She said it the way a person repeats a phrase in a foreign language, carefully, as though making sure she has heard it correctly. "That ship sailed with our civilians, Elder Velmassian." The room was very quiet. 342,117 people, she continued. Her voice was still calm, still even. The Dominion did not give them a warning. They did not give them a chance to leave. They destroyed the evacuation pods first. Did you know that? That detail is in the forensic report we filed with the Conclave 7 days after the attack. The Velhari gunners were briefed to eliminate escape capacity first. That means someone planned it. Someone thought about those pods and made a deliberate decision. She unfolded her hands. I have thought about that decision every day for 6 months. Velmassian was quiet. I want to be very clear about something, Vale said. We are not going to harm Velhari civilians. We have never had any intention of doing so. Every strike in this campaign has been against a military target. Our forces have been given explicit orders on this, and those orders will be followed. She looked at him steadily. That is not compassion. That is simply who we are. We do not make war on people who cannot fight back. We never have. She stood up slowly, which meant the meeting was moving toward its end. But the Dominion's military, the ships, the installations, the command structure, and every officer who sat in a room and decided that 340,000 civilians were an acceptable obstacle, that will be dismantled, completely, not out of cruelty, not out of revenge. She looked at him one more time. Out of consequence, because a galaxy in which that decision goes unanswered is a galaxy in which the next ambitious government looks at Covenant Station and thinks, that worked. Velmacian was quiet for a long moment, and if the Conclave formally demands a ceasefire, then the Conclave can formally demand it, she said, not unkindly, and we will formally note the demand, and we will continue. He left without a ceasefire agreement. He was a wise enough man to understand that he was not going to get one. On the seventh day, the Dominion's frontier commander, a 4-star general named Rethvakar, attempted a concentrated counterattack with what remained of his available fleet. He had about 60% of his normal combat strength. The supply disruptions and relay station seizures had taken a serious toll, but 60% was still a significant force, and Rethvakar was a capable officer. He found that Admiral Vale had anticipated exactly this move. The human fleet that met him was not the fleet he had expected. It was not the same rapid strike forces that had hit the frontier installations. It was heavier, slower, built for endurance rather than speed. Ships with enormous forward shielding and weapon systems designed for sustained engagement at long range. The battle lasted 9 hours. At the end of it, Rethvakar had 14 ships left, and he was using them to cover a full retreat toward the Dominion's interior systems. He filed a report to Central Command that was, by the standards of military communications, close to desperate. He described the human forces as operating on a doctrinal model we have no framework for, and requested urgent reinforcement. Central Command sent what they could. It was not enough. The advance continued. What humans do that others cannot. Nobody could explain it. That was the honest truth. Every military analyst in the Galactic Conclave had a model for how wars worked. You advanced. You fought. You broke the enemy's ability to resist. The civilian population behind your lines was your concern, your own people, your supply base, your reason for fighting. The civilian population on the other side was a problem you managed. You kept them away from your forces, you controlled their infrastructure where necessary, and you hoped they did not become an active problem. What you did not do was feed them. What you did not do was send your medical ships to treat their sick and injured, while your warships were still fighting their military 2 systems over. What you did not do was have your engineering team spend 3 days repairing a Velhari water processing plant in a captured border town, when those 3 days could have been spent advancing your lines. And yet, every correspondent, every observer, every conclave monitor assigned to the human advance filed the same reports, and those reports all contained the same note of baffled disbelief. Yes, the humans were fighting. Yes, they were dismantling the Velhari military with a thoroughness that military historians were already struggling to find comparisons for. But behind the warships, moving in their wake like a second fleet with a completely different mission, came the supply transports, the medical vessels, the humanitarian teams. They were not performing. There were no news crews on most of these ships. There was no audience being catered to. The humans simply seemed to be constitutionally unable to move through a place where people were suffering and not stop to help. It made no strategic sense. Every Velhari military advisor who modeled it came to the same conclusion. This behavior slowed the human advance, consumed resources that could have been redirected to combat operations, and gave material benefit to the population of an enemy nation. By any rational calculus of warfare, it was a mistake. The humans kept doing it anyway. Esethara had not gone home after the campaign began. She had not been ordered to stay. She had simply requested assignment to the Conclave's Civilian Observation Unit, the group of neutral monitors embedded with the human forces to document compliance with galactic laws of war. The request had been approved with some surprise. A Velhari national embedding with human forces was unusual, but Esethara had reasons, and she kept them to herself. She had been moving with the observation unit for 3 weeks when they reached the border settlement of Kethamara. Kethamara was a Velhari civilian town of about 12,000 people, too small to matter strategically, too close to the frontier to have been untouched by the conflict. The town's local government had fled when the fighting got close. The garrison that had been stationed there had pulled back with the main Velhari retreat. What remained were 12,000 ordinary people, farmers, craftspeople, families, who had locked their doors and waited, and did not know if the human forces would treat them the way Velhari propaganda said they would. The human forces arrived at Kethamara on a cold morning, local time. There was no bombardment. The lead vehicles, ground transports, not weapons platforms, stopped at the edge of town and waited. A small group of soldiers got out. They were armed because they were soldiers in a war zone, and being unarmed would have been genuinely foolish, but their weapons were slung and their hands were visible. One of them was carrying a large printed sign with text in Velhari script. Esethara, watching from the observation transport, asked her translator to read it. "We are not here to harm you. Our medical team is behind us. If you need food, water, or medical help, please come to the square. You are safe." The town was very still for a long time. Then a door opened. An old Velhari woman, gray-scaled, moving slowly, came out of her house and stood on the street looking at the soldiers. One of the soldiers, a young man with dark skin and an easy way of standing, raised a hand in greeting. He said something the translator caught as a simple hello in basic Velhari. The old woman looked at him for a moment. Then she pointed down the street, toward what turned out to be the town's clinic, which had run out of basic medical supplies 2 weeks ago. The soldier nodded. He turned back to his team and said something. Within 20 minutes, the medical transport had moved up and the town's clinic was being restocked. By the afternoon, the square was full. Esethara walked through Kethamara for 2 hours. She watched human soldiers distributing food rations with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this before, in other towns on other worlds. She watched a medic, a young woman with her hair pulled back, and her sleeves rolled up, treat a child's infected hand, while the child's mother watched with the taut, barely controlled fear of a parent who is trying to decide whether to trust. She watched the medic say something to the mother, something quiet, and saw the mother's shoulders drop very slightly from their raised, braced position. She found herself watching one soldier in particular. He was young, barely 20, she guessed, with the kind of face that still had some softness in it. He had been assigned to food distribution, and he was doing his job steadily and without complaint. But at some point during the afternoon, a small Velhari child had detached from his family and wandered over and simply sat down next to the soldier where he was taking a break. The soldier looked at the child. The child looked at him. Neither of them spoke the other's language. The soldier reached into his ration pack and broke off a piece of something, a compressed food bar, the kind soldiers carried as emergency nutrition, and held it out. The child considered it, considered him, and then took it. They sat together in the square for 20 minutes. The soldier used a translator bead to teach the child a few words, simple ones, colors and numbers, and the child taught him something in return, some local word that made the child laugh when the soldier tried to pronounce it. At some point, the child's family came and found him, And there was a long, tense moment when the child's father stood looking at this human soldier who had been sitting with his child. The soldier stood up. He did not reach for his weapon. He raised one hand open, the way humans apparently signal that they mean no harm. He said something the translator caught as, "He is safe. He was just teaching me a word." The father looked at him for a long moment. Then he dipped his head just slightly. It was a Velhari gesture of acknowledgement. Not thanks, that would have been too much too fast, just, "I see you, I understand." The soldier dipped his own head back, mirroring the gesture, apparently having learned it somewhere in his briefings. Esethara watched all of this and felt something she had not expected to feel. She was not sure there was a clean word for it in Velhari. It was something like grief that is not for yourself, the feeling of seeing something that makes your own world look smaller than it actually is. She had grown up in a civilization that treated warfare as a transaction and civilians as a variable. She had never questioned it because she had never seen anything else. The Dominion's power was real, its reach was vast, and its logic that strength determined outcome, that sentiment was a weakness, had seemed like simply the way things were. But this was not a transaction. These humans were not gaining anything by feeding this town. They were not earning goodwill that would help them win a battle somewhere. They were not being watched by anyone whose opinion mattered strategically. They were doing it because there were people who were hungry, and they were people who had food, and somehow, in the deep wiring of whatever humans were made of, that was simply sufficient reason. They hated. She knew they hated. She had heard the recording from Covenant Station. She had seen Admiral Vale's eyes when she talked about the evacuation pods. These humans were in the deepest grief, conducting the most methodical military campaign in recent galactic history, and they still could not walk past a hungry child without stopping. She did not know what to do with that. She filed her observer's report that night and wrote, in the notes section, a single sentence that was not standard protocol for an observation report. "I do not think we understood what we were dealing with." 3 weeks later, the last major Velhari fleet formation was cornered at the fortress world of Seth Prime. It was the most significant battle of the campaign. The Dominion had concentrated everything they had left into one last defensive stand at their most heavily fortified system. Vale had anticipated this. She did not rush the engagement. She positioned her fleet carefully, eliminated the fortress world's long-range support capacity over 2 days of methodical fighting, and then offered the defending fleet commander a choice: surrender or be destroyed. The defending commander chose destruction. It was, in many ways, a very Velhari decision. The Battle of Seth Prime lasted 11 hours. At the end of it, the Velhari Dominion had no functional military fleet. What remained of their naval power were scattered patrol ships too small and too isolated to form a coherent force. The Dominion's military was broken. Admiral Vale recorded the end of the battle in the ship's log with a single line: "Campaign objectives achieved. Proceeding to final phase." She went to her quarters afterward and sat for a while in the dark and did not call anyone. She sat with the number 342,117, and she let herself feel the weight of it fully for the first time since the morning she had closed that casualty feed and told her crew to remember. Then she got up, washed her face, and went back to work. There was still the matter of the terms. The terms. They came aboard the Remembrance on a gray morning by ship's clock, 9 of them in total, walking in the careful way of people who are not accustomed to being on the losing side of anything. They were in formal military dress, immaculate uniforms, rank insignia polished, the disciplined appearance of officers who had decided that if this was the end, they were going to face it with their dignity intact. At their head was Supreme Commander Vrethax. He was old, by Velhari standards, heavily scarred along the left side of his face from some earlier battle in a career that had spanned 4 decades. He had been one of the architects of the Dominion's expansion policy. He had sat in the room where the Cathara operation had been approved. He had read the casualty projections that included Covenant Station and had signed the authorization anyway. He walked through the corridors of the Remembrance with his spine straight and his face expressionless. He looked at nothing. Cathara was there too, not as part of the Dominion delegation but as a conclave observer, standing near the back of the room when the delegation entered. She watched Vrethax take his position across the long table from Admiral Vale and saw, in the way he held himself, the calculation he was still running. He was a man who had spent his entire career understanding war as a thing with a price, and he was trying to determine what price was about to be named. Vale was already in the room when they arrived. She was standing, not sitting, standing at the side of the table, one hand resting lightly on its surface, reviewing something on a small data pad. She looked up when the delegation entered. She did not smile. She did not look triumphant. She looked like a person with a very specific task to complete who was going to complete it properly. "Supreme Commander Vrethax," she said, "please sit." They sat. The terms were read by Vale's senior legal officer, Commander Teshin, a precise and serious man who read clearly and without hurry. He had a deep, steady voice, and the room was very quiet while he spoke. The first term, every flag officer and military planner involved in the authorization and execution of the Covenant Station strike was to be remanded to the Galactic Conclave's War Crimes Tribunal, not to human custody, to a neutral body governed by galactic law. A list of names was attached. It had been compiled over 6 months of intelligence work and was thorough. Vrethax's name was on the list. He did not move. The second term, Velhari military capacity, was to be reduced to a defined defensive level and monitored by a joint conclave oversight commission for a minimum of 50 years. No offensive fleet construction. No expansion operations. The frontier fortifications already built in the Cathara corridor were to be dismantled. The third term, substantial reparations, the figure significantly larger than anything the Dominion had offered in their initial communique, were to be paid into a dedicated fund. The fund had a name. It was called the Covenant Station Recovery and Remembrance Fund, and its purpose was to support the families of those killed, the communities that had lost people, and a long-term program of humanitarian work in the regions affected by the conflict. The fourth term, Velhari civilian governance, was to remain fully intact. No occupation, no annexation, no territory seized. The Dominion's homeworld, its colonies, its internal political structure, all of it untouched. The civilian government of the Velhari people would continue to govern the Velhari people. There was a small stir among the delegation at this point. They had not expected it. The fifth term was the last, and Commander Teshin paused before reading it, not for drama, but because it was written differently from the others. The other terms were in the formal language of legal instruments. This one was shorter, plainer. A memorial is to be constructed on the Velhari homeworld, in a location of sufficient public prominence, bearing the name of Covenant Station and the names of all 342,117 individuals who died there. The memorial is to carry a single inscription. These names are a promise. This will not happen again. Commander Teshin finished reading. He set the document down. The room was silent. Vrethax looked at the document in front of him for a long time. His face had not changed during the reading. It had stayed careful and controlled, the way a professional soldier's face stays when he is absorbing difficult information and has not yet decided how to process it. He looked up at Admiral Vale. "You had us," he said. His voice was even and direct, the voice of a man who had spent his career speaking plainly. "The fleet is gone. The frontier installations are gone. We have no capacity to resist further. You had us completely." He looked at the terms again. "You could have taken everything, territory, resources, our capacity to govern ourselves." He looked back at her. "Why didn't you?" It was a genuine question, Not rhetorical, not defiant. He actually wanted to understand. Vale looked at him for a moment. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, which she had not done until now. She put her hands flat on the table. "Because we're not doing this to take something," she said. Her voice was quiet, quiet enough that the people at the back of the room had to lean slightly to hear her. "We're doing this so that 342,000 names mean something, so that what happened at Covenant Station has a weight to it that lasts." She looked at the document. "If we took your world, we'd be conquerors. History has enough of those." She looked back at him. "We want a galaxy where Covenant Station never happens again. That's what we want. That is the only thing we want." Vrethax was quiet for a long moment. "The memorial," he said, "on our homeworld." "Yes." "You want us to build it?" "Yes." "Why?" Vale considered the question carefully, the way she had considered everything throughout this whole long process. "Because forgetting is what makes it happen again," she said. "We are not asking your people to carry guilt forever. We are asking them to carry the knowledge. There is a difference." She looked at him steadily. "Your civilian population did not choose this, but they live in the civilization that produced it. The memorial is not punishment. It is the cost of not letting the knowledge disappear." Vrethax looked at the document for a long time. His face had changed slightly. Something had shifted behind it. Not remorse exactly, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of a process that might get there eventually. He picked up the authorization stylus. He signed. The delegation filed out in the same careful way they had entered. Most of them left quickly, with the quiet efficiency of people who have finished a difficult thing and want to not be in this room anymore. Esethara was the last one out. She had been standing near the door during the entire proceeding and had not spoken. Her role as observer did not require her to. But as the room emptied and she moved toward the door, she stopped. She turned back. Admiral Vale was still at the table, reviewing the signed document with the same focused attention she brought to everything. Her legal officer had stepped out. She was alone in the room. Esethara stood in the doorway for a moment. "Admiral," she said. Vale looked up. Esethara had prepared nothing. She had not planned to say anything. But standing in the doorway of this room, in this ship named Remembrance, with the signed terms on the table and everything that had happened in the past 7 months sitting in the air between them, she found that she had words after all. "I am sorry," she said. "For Covenant Station, I am truly sorry." She meant it. She had never meant anything more in her professional life. She was not apologizing on behalf of the Dominion, or as a diplomatic act, or because it was strategically sensible. She was apologizing because she was a person who had spent 7 months watching what 342,000 deaths did to the people who had loved them, and who were now trying to answer for them without losing themselves in the process. She was apologizing because she had sat in a town square and watched a young soldier teach a Velhari child a word, while 6 light-years away his government was still fighting for its life. She was apologizing because it was the only honest thing left to say. Vale looked at her. The ice that lived in those deep-water eyes, the ice that had been there since the morning she had closed the casualty feed, and said, "We will remember every one of them," thawed, just slightly, for just a moment. "I know," Vale said. "That's why there's still a Velhari Dominion." Esethara held her gaze for a moment. Then she dipped her head in the Velhari gesture of acknowledgement, the same gesture the father in Kethamara had given a young soldier in a town square, and she left. Admiral Seraphine Vale sat alone in the briefing room of the HCSV Remembrance for a few minutes after everyone had gone. The signed document was in front of her. The campaign was over. The military objective, to dismantle the Velhari Dominion's capacity to ever do what it had done at Covenant Station, was achieved. The legal process against the officers responsible would take years, but it would happen. The memorial would be built. The names would be written. She thought about the park on Ring 7, the one with artificial grass and a painted blue sky ceiling. She had read about it in the station's community records during the recovery operation, in a piece written by a local journalist about the small good things that made Covenant Station feel like a real home. The journalist had described parents bringing their children there on weekends. She had described the way the ceiling light was set to cycle through a whole day, so the painted sky went from morning blue to evening orange, and children who had grown up on the station and never seen a real planet would still know what a sunset looked like. That journalist's name was on the list. Her children's names were on the list. Vale sat with that for a moment. Then she picked up the signed document, stood up, and walked out of the briefing room. There was a debriefing to run, reports to file, fleet movements to coordinate, and 100 administrative tasks that would need her attention before the day was over. The galaxy did not stop moving because one important thing had been finished. But she paused for just a second in the corridor outside the briefing room and looked at the wall, at the photographs pinned there by her crew, the small personal things that crews put up in the spaces where they spend their lives. There was a photograph of a park, she noticed, artificial grass, a painted ceiling. Someone had put it there. She did not know who. She did not ask. She straightened it slightly, where one corner had come loose from the wall. Then she walked back to the bridge, and she got back to work.